She is the Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer for Rockwell Automation, the world's largest company dedicated to industrial automation and information to make its customers more productive and the world more sustainable. For more than a decade, Susan has led the company's human resources function for its 22,000 employees in 80 countries. With almost 30 years of professional experience, Susan was named a National Association of Human Resources Fellow in 2016, which is the highest honor that can be achieved by an individual in the HR profession. So let's welcome Susan.
Yes.
All right, well, I can just feel the energy building after that last panel. I wish I could have heard more of it. It's really a privilege to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm going to talk to you about something that I know is near and dear to everyone's heart, including my own, and that is your career. Right? How many people care about their career? That was done with such enthusiasm, I could hardly see it. Yes, we all care about our career, and so there are a couple things to know. Let me just get on to my first slide here. All right, secrets to success. What you need to know is that the number one reason why people leave their current companies is because they're frustrated with their career process. They're either frustrated that they're not developing enough, or they're not advancing fast enough, or they were missed for an opportunity that they felt they were really well qualified for. It's the number one reason why generally people leave companies, and it's the number one reason at Rockwell Automation. We look at all that statistics. And so we care a lot about how our career is progressing. And I think we all have certainly like these invisible milestones in our head that we feel like we need to be tracking against. And if we're not meeting those milestones that we've laid out, that somehow we're not in the place where we think we should be and we get frustrated. So my hope today is I'm going to share some insight with you that will help you get new insight about yourself and potentially give you information that will help you reach your full potential. Does that sound good? And I'm going to unlock the secrets to success because I've seen a lot of things in my years of experience that have led me to conclude what really matters when people are getting moved in organizations. And I think it'll give you some good ways of thinking about yourself. One thing that's really important to note, there's some really cool research from an organization called Corporate Leadership Council. And the Corporate Leadership Council says roughly 25% of people overestimate themselves, 25% of people underestimate themselves, and only about 50% of people have an accurate view of how others see them. So imagine the disconnect. I always think about, I wonder which category I'm in. Am I in the overestimate, underestimate, or about right? So it's really important to have a good understanding about who you are and where you are best suited. And so I'm going to help you understand that a little bit more today. All right? Woo! Feel the energy going. All right, so you know it's snowing outside. I've had way too much coffee, and it's after lunch. So here you go. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a quick little brief intro on Rockwell Automation because I think it's always helpful to know the context from which the speaker is coming from. I'm going to talk like for 2 seconds about me, and it's not about me. That part is not relevant. But what is relevant is my experience, and my experience is why I'm here today because I really do feel like I have some answers to some of the things that are happening that many of us find confusing in organizations. Then I'm going to go through a model that is really cool, and I use it almost every single day, that really helps explain what's going on. And then lastly, I can't even read the slide because my eyes are going bad. What does it say over there? Oh, questions and answers. So I need a new prescription. So that's my plan. Let me start out with the first thing. Rockwell Automation. Rockwell Automation is a Fortune 500 company. I think most of you are familiar with it. Where's the Rockwell Automation table? Tables. Oh boy. It's been a tough quarter. Maybe everyone's a little bit worn out. They're glad to be here. But Rockwell Automation is the building on the south side of town, the big clock tower building, right? You recognize that building. It's a big fortress on the south side of the town. And we have, as was mentioned, 22,000 employees, roughly 60% based outside the United States. And we help companies make whatever they make. So if you imagine any manufacturing company, oil and gas company, food and beverage company, automobile and tire company, entertainment, we're helping them to put automation technology and products and services into their production lines to make them optimized and effective. That's basically what Rockwell Automation does. And what you'll note here, although I think the slides are hard to read because they've got a lot of words on them, Rockwell Automation is a really cool company. I'm not going to go through all the awards we've won. We've won a lot of awards, some that we're the most proud of. For 10 years, we won the World's Most Ethical Companies award from Ethisphere. They get 2,000 plus nominations, about less than 200 win that award. We're really proud of that. And one of the other awards that we won it last year, is the Catalyst Award. Catalyst is the organization, nonprofit organization in New York that did the original, I think the original glass ceiling research. And they recognize 2 or 3 companies per year that are doing great work for women. And Rock Automation was a winner last year. So those are a couple cool things. And you know, I can't help but do this because I know I'm not supposed to do this, but if you're looking for a new job, Rock Automation is interested. So see me afterwards, or anybody, where's Sherry Bench? Sherry Bench, raise your hand. There you are. Sherry Bench can get your email to me and we're happy to talk about anything you want to talk about. So you might as well take advantage of it, right? All right. So that was who Rock Automation is, so me. What's important to know about me, as was mentioned, is I have 30 years of experience working in many different companies. I've had a really amazing career. I feel like God has blessed me with some amazing gifts that have helped me be successful. But what's relevant is that I've worked across industries. I've worked in manufacturing. I've worked now in engineering technology, banking, management consulting. And so I've been working with people for 30 years. And I know you're all sitting back right now thinking I looked way too young to have 30 years in my career.
Yes.
So, but I do, and that's why I think it's so important to understand that I know what doesn't work and why things are so confusing in organizations, and I'm going to try to debunk some of that. And of course, I'm very proud of my 2 sons. The one on the left, Sam, he's in high school. He's been trying to negotiate with me for the last 4 months, and he does not need a high school degree, so that's not going very well. And then my oldest is a freshman at Madison. He's doing really well. And I pretty much worked to fund my horseback riding habit, but that's a whole other story. So let me tell you about why there's so much confusion about careers and what really matters. I don't know about you, but every time I open like Harvard Business Review or any leadership journal, there's always an article that talks about leadership. And if you're like me and you read a lot of those articles, you realize that there's a lot of opinion about what is leadership, what matters in organizations, and you know, just broadly leadership. Maybe you're not aspiring to a leadership role, maybe you are, but I find that every time I read one of those articles, I walk away more confused about how does it help me explain to people in the organization what really matters. Something else that I've noticed too is that a lot of companies, how many companies out there have competency models, soft skill competencies? You know, like leadership competencies, you know, good problem solver, good communicator, a good collaborator. Are you familiar with those? Does that sound sort of familiar? Yes? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Most companies, most HR people like myself, and I certainly have done this in my past, develop these really, what we think are really helpful competency models to explain to people that you need to score well on these, whatever, 10, 12, 15 competencies. And if you do, that's a good thing. And you know, what I have found in my experience is it doesn't matter how many competencies there are. Let's just say there are 10 competencies. And I'm telling you, I do the same thing. So I'm going to just speak for every one of us in this room. If my manager asks me to do a self-assessment on a competency model, each one of us feels pretty good about ourselves, right? How many people feel like, you know, I'm pretty good at, I'm a good collaborator, etc. So if there are 10 competencies and I'm doing a self-assessment, I can guarantee you that I'm going to say 8 of them I'm really good at. And most likely, most of you are going to say 8 of them you're really good at, right? And there might be one that we say, well, you know, I could be a little better at that. That's an area of opportunity. And perhaps one that I might say I need a lot of work on. And so I turn my assessment into my manager, and here's what happens when the manager sits down with each one of us to go through his or her opinion about how you score on that competency assessment. Okay, how many of you in here are people managers? Raise your hand. Okay, so we have a handful of people managers. Now, you can argue with me if this is not true for you, but as a people manager, I've absolutely been guilty of this. So I'm sitting down with an employee. Actually, let's pretend like you're my manager. What's your name? Raphael? Okay, Raphael's my manager. He's asked me to do my 360 assessment. I've done it. I'm really proud of it because I'm good on 8 of them. He's also done it, and guess what? He said I'm good on 5 on his own. He wrote that, maybe 6. But there are some that he really thinks I need a lot of work on. So in the moment, Raphael's trying to figure out how honest can I be with Susan? Because if I'm really honest with her, she might get really mad. She might get really disengaged. She might decide to sort of disengage from her job even though she doesn't quit. That's like the worst possible thing. Or she could get upset. She could get angry, right? I mean, how many of us get really frustrated when we feel like our managers don't have a good feel for who we are as people? It happens all the time. So in the moment, and Raphael, I have done this as much as I'm pretending like you've done this, in the moment, you're making a judgment about how honest can you be. So let's just say you thought 6 were really good, maybe 3 I needed a lot of work on, and 1 that was really poor. He's making a judgment about how honest and direct he can be with me. And of course, there are all kinds of factors that influence people. He doesn't want to necessarily say something that might offend me, and I might think he's discriminating against me because I'm a woman. So he's trying to judge, how am I going to respond? All these things are happening in the minds of the managers. And so we sit down, and he's adjusting his view to try to manage me because he doesn't want me to be ineffective walking out of the room. And it's not because he's not a good manager, and it's not because I'm not a good manager. We're trying to keep the team energized. And sometimes we feel if we're too direct with people, maybe they're not going to be as energized. And so there's that moment where there's a missed opportunity for direct and honest feedback. It happens all the time, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody perhaps in this room. So that's the first place where there's confusion. I've had so many employees come to me, they're frustrated because they scored really well on a self-assessment on their 360, when they went out and asked for feedback or their manager gave them feedback, and then they don't get promoted to a job that they thought they were qualified for. And that's part of the confusion. Okay, so the other part of the confusion is, a lot of times companies have competencies or criteria about what it takes to get advancement, whether it's technical advancement careers or leadership advancement. And there are always those cases where people get promoted and you're sitting back scratching your head, like, how did that person get promoted? She didn't have the kind of experience that I do, right? Am I making this up? This is what happens in organizations. Especially if I thought I should have had the job, if I feel like I've got the right resume and another person got the job, it doesn't matter who, and she didn't have the same experiences or he didn't have the same experiences as I do. In fact, maybe I thought that they may have scored more poorly on some assessment, but they get promoted, you get really angry, which is why we leave companies. Believe me, I'm talking from my own experience too. I'm not just saying this because I've worked with people for 30 years. Then the other problem is that we see people that get promoted that had the skills and experiences. Somebody talked about that on the last panel, and they fail. And you're sitting back scratching your head about why did this person fail? And so I did one more thing, that just because I like doing crazy things on my weekends. This is really crazy. Don't try this at home. I did an assessment of 3 CEOs I've worked with on a competency model, just comparing 3 CEOs from 2 large Fortune 500 companies, 2 from my last employer, Kellogg's, and 1 from my current employer, my CEO who hired me. And so I just sat down and pretended like I was their manager and I was going to score them on an assessment. This is great Saturday afternoon fun. And so what was really interesting is first CEO was a guy named Carlos Gutierrez. Some of you may know him. He was the CEO at Kellogg's for many years. He started as a sales rep and eventually became Secretary of Commerce under Bush, an amazing leader. And if I was scoring Carlos, I would give him a lot of high scores in terms of his ability to stand up in front of an audience and inspire people. He had this gift to help people see the vision of where he wanted to take the company, but he did not handle conflict well. And so he had some dynamics on his leadership team that were not necessarily as productive as they could have been. So, he would have had some good scores on an assessment and maybe some that he really needed to work on. The next CEO that I did an assessment on was a guy named David Mackay. David Mackay followed Carlos a few CEOs later. He was an Australian, and he was as gregarious and as outgoing as Carlos was quiet and introverted. And David Mackay was a brilliant business leader, very savvy, would have scored really high in the financial acumen, the business P&L, understanding what levers to pull to drive profits and revenue. And you knew that if David Mackay was coming to your office to see you, you were likely going to get hit by a 2x4, because that's how he dealt with people. He was really hard on people. I would see him in the parking lot, and he would say, "We need to fire so-and-so," because I didn't like how they acted in the meeting. I mean, he had some, I would describe, somewhat impulsive behaviors around talent. He eventually retired, so anyway. The last CEO, do you see the air quotes? Yeah. I hope this isn't being, well, it is being videoed, so cut that part out. Make sure you don't include that part. Yeah, make sure you cut that from the video. Because I don't want him to find out I said that. The last CEO was Keith Nosbush, who was the CEO who hired me at Rockwell Automation. And honestly, Keith Nosbush is one of the most brilliant leaders I've ever had the privilege of working for. He was also highly introverted. If he was up here doing a presentation to you all, and you all who know him know this, he would read his script word by word. You would be a little bit bored, but he would read it as he prepared it. He wouldn't want to deviate from it. And he was not a real outgoing person, and very introverted, very analytical, very serious. But if you were interacting with Keith in a one-on-one setting, you felt like the most important person in the world. He had that gift to bring out the best of everybody. But there were some things, he was not really a team guy. He didn't do team things. He did one-on-one things with people or two-on-one people based on how he did his work. So I sit back and I say, here are 3 CEOs, all, in most terms, successful leaders, but there's no rhyme or reason based on competency models as to why each one of those guys got to the level they got to. And I could give technical examples as well. Technical leaders that move up to senior principal engineers, it's the same story. And so I sit back and I say, there's just way too much confusion. It's no wonder nobody knows what's going on with your career. So I want you to think about one thing right now. I want you to think about your own career. And I want you to pretend like you've been asked by a Hollywood movie producer to produce a movie about your career. So I want you to just take a minute and imagine, what title would you give to your movie about your career? Just take a second. I'll give you like 20 seconds. Think about it. What title would you give your career? Some of your titles might be really uplifting. Some might be really depressing. Whatever title you want, think of a title. Does anyone have a title they're willing to share? I have a prize if you would volunteer. Yes?
Hashtag the struggle is real.
Hashtag the struggle is real. I'm going to give you $20 for saying that. Oh my God. All right, see, I'm not kidding. Interactive presentation. Thank you. Hashtag the struggle is real. I love that. One more. Yes?
Are we there yet?
Are we there yet? Get your $20. Seriously. I've learned doing presentations, people like to talk.
Okay, I'm going to talk next time.
So the point of this story is it doesn't matter what your title is. If you're not happy with your title, you still have an opportunity to change the outcome of what your career title can be, okay? And so that's my purpose here, is for you to think about, how do I get to a place where I'm really happy with and proud of the title that I have? When I think about my title in my movie career, it's called The Big Adventure. And I'm pretty sure Meg Ryan will play me someday. All right, so you get it. There's a lot of confusion. How many of you agree there's confusion about what matters when managers and leaders are making decisions? Everybody raise your hand. I would put myself in that category. All right, now, what I'm going to share with you is so cool that, this is worth more than 20 bucks, I'm guaranteeing you. I use this every day. I was introduced to this body of research almost 22 years ago. And the research came from, original researcher was a Canadian. He set out on a path to help people. He was a medical doctor. He had his medical degree from Johns Hopkins, and he really had this passion around helping people be healthier. And as he did his work, he realized that you couldn't just focus on the physical. You had to focus on the holistic person. And so he really started to look at the world of social sciences, and he got his PhD from Harvard to really understand people and what makes people work, what makes people feel comfortable and confident and trusting that they're working in a trusting environment. And so he set out on a path, and it ended up being a number of years where he studied organizations all over the world. And so his concepts, and the concepts I'm going to share with you today, resonate. I don't care what country you're in. I've done this presentation all over the world with Rockwell Automation: Singapore, China, India, Mexico, Canada, US. Where else have I been? I've been all over Europe. I've done it. And so the principles resonate because the work was done in global companies, big and small, for-profit and not-for-profit. And you're going to see that the insights that came from this research are very intuitive. Good managers are already using this model. We just had never had a language for it, which is another reason why there's so much confusion around it. And so that's my goal here, is to share that with you. And the body of research that this researcher did, and then many of his contemporaries have followed, he really did 3 different things, and we're going to talk about one of those things today. First thing he did is he really looked at, how do you design an organization to drive a strategy? Because not every company is the same, not every strategy is the same, and you need to understand the strategy and figure out how you design the work in the organization to drive the strategy. So it's got some really cool principles there. The next body of work he has, which we are going to talk about, is once you know the organization design and the roles that you need to create the strategy and future value and innovation for your shareholders and your customers, how do you match people into those roles? How do you determine who is most suited to do these roles or future roles? And so that concept of who's most suited is going to be a really key thing to remember as we get into this. The third thing he did, and I'm not going to talk about it today, but he had a whole body of work around how do you create managerial practices that create a trusting and high-performing company. And so his work around how do you determine who's most suited or the suitability of capability for roles is what we're going to talk about. And I have really complicated charts, so hang with me. Ready? He said 4 things matter. How's that? That's really complicated. I love it when you can actually read a chart, right? I work with a lot of engineers with a lot of information on charts, and it's really fun to just put up a few words. He said 4 things matter. And I want you to be thinking about these 4 things as they relate to you, okay? And I'm going to bring each of these 4 things to life with some stories, because that makes it real for everybody. The first thing he said that matters is the really easy one. We always give it an acronym, but SKI stands for Skills, Knowledge, Experience, and Education. And I love it that one of the panelists, I'm sorry I don't know her name, talked about that even if you don't have the skills, knowledge, experience, and education for a particular role, doesn't mean you're not the most suited candidate to do that role. This is where it gets a little confusing. A lot of companies put a lot of emphasis on someone's skills, knowledge, experience, and education. What Dr. Jack said was that you really need to think about, does a person have the skills, knowledge, experience, and education to do the role, or could they learn it in a reasonable time with the right support? And that's really critical. Because I tell you what, I did not have the skills, knowledge, and experience to be the head of HR at Rockwell when Keith decided to hire me. I'd never been in a top global HR job. I didn't have board of directors experience. I didn't have executive compensation experience. I had never run a global function all over the world. I had a lot of gaps on SKI. And I can guarantee you that he interviewed a lot of candidates who had a lot more SKI than I did, a lot more. The interesting thing about skills, knowledge, and experience and education, and I'm sure you can think of stories too, there's a story, I worked with a leader back in my Kellogg days, and if you were to look at his resume, you would read his resume and say, oh my gosh, this is an A+ chief HR officer. This guy had like an A+ resume to be the head of HR for a Fortune 500 company, right? And he was a nice guy. Well, I remember one day I happened to report into the business leader, the president, running a $4 billion business. We were running the morning foods business, Pop-Tarts, cereal, fruit snacks, and waffles. Really big business for Kellogg's. And I remember one day my president, a guy named Jeff, turned to me and he said, Susan, if I ran my business like your boss runs HR, we would never sell a box of cereal. I can't believe, I mean, that's exactly right. And so you say, all right, well, he had the technical skills, knowledge, experience, and education to be the best head of HR ever in the world. And 14 months later, he was asked to leave. And I remember a story one time where there was some news, remember my favorite CEO, Mr. Mackay? Somebody had given him a little tidbit of knowledge that our business unit had overspent its merit budget because we were arrogant. Ooh. My boss was up in his office. My boss, the one who had the A+ resume, called me on the phone and said, I just want to give you a heads up. Mackay's really mad at you and Jeff because you guys overspent your merit budget, and I just wanted you to be prepared. Click. Okay, that wasn't very helpful. So I went down and got all the facts and learned that it actually was a miscommunication. It had nothing to do with overspending the merit budget. My manager, the HR leader, knew we had not overspent it. I already presented that to him. It was a misunderstanding. It was about accrual for the current year merit budget, and there was just some gap in what the estimate was, and they had to make it up for the remainder of the year. And so there was an immediate response of fear, and an immediate response of no support, and an immediate response of throwing me out and saying good luck. And that was the response. So he had all the SKI, but he was ineffective in his role. The other funny part of the story, and I know you can think of examples in your own career, where people that are promoted don't actually have the SKI for the job, and they turn out to be brilliant. I have another Kellogg story. I'm sorry for all the Kellogg stories, but I spent 12 years there. There was a guy that came into the company. He was 33 years old. John Bryant was his name. John Bryant comes in a business development role, and one of his first assignments is to be really the overseer, devil's advocate of the largest acquisition Kellogg ever did. When they bought Keebler, the Keebler elves, right? So Tony the Tiger and the elves coming together. We had some culture work to do, but we worked through that. But John Bryant played the devil's advocate on a deal that was $6 billion of debt. It was bringing on 15,000 employees, and it was a significant undertaking, diversifying the portfolio. It was a major strategic change in direction. 33 years old, he's playing this role. I was lucky to be the HR lead on that project, so I got to see him on a day in and day out basis. And so at age 36, he gets promoted to chief financial officer of the company. You know, a lot of people sat back and scratched their heads. He doesn't have the skills, knowledge, experience, and education to be CFO of this company. Well, guess what? He was so good at it. 2 years later, they had him keep the CFO job, and they handed on the executive vice president job for North America. He's now doing 2 executive roles at age 30, I think he was 36, 37. And he did those 2 roles so effectively, by the time he was 43, he was the CEO. And he just recently retired as CEO at the company at his own decision. It was his choice. The guy was very capable. So he's another example of why there's so much confusion, because everybody sits back and says, how can this guy get to be the CEO in such a fast amount of time? And I'm gonna come back and answer that in just a minute. Then my last example on ski, my 3 very favorite bosses in HR did not have any HR background at all. One was an executive vice president of supply chain who came out of retirement when our head of HR died suddenly of cancer. I would have taken a bullet for that leader. He was so brilliant. We took $39 million of money out of our healthcare plan that year from retirees because we had no caps, we had all kinds of issues. It's gonna hurt the company long term. That man did more for HR in his short tenure before we hired a full-time HR leader with no HR background. It was him. There was a woman who was from Italy who was also supply chain. They gave her Asia Pacific supply chain, and then for development assignment, they put her in as our type HR job. It was her that made the decision that I needed international experience, and she sent me overseas to do HR in England for the European business. I loved her. Still to this day, good friends with her. And then the other one was an attorney. HR reported to our general counsel, and again, one of the best bosses I had. No HR background. So ski is only a piece of the equation. It's 1/4 of the equation. And I'm going to tell you that when managers are making decisions about who gets certain jobs, they're making trade-offs across these 4 things based on the need of the jobs. So you're good on ski? Everybody understands ski? And understand that even though you may think you have the perfect ski, resume looks great, you may not necessarily be the most suited candidate for a job. So I'm going to tell you why. So the second very complicated slide I have is IPC. IPC stands for, whoops, I guess I don't have it up there. IPC stands for Information Processing Capability. And this is a really simple concept. I want you to think about something really core and basic, and that is work varies in complexity, and people's ability to handle complexity also varies. It's really simple. Not all work is created equally, and not everyone can handle different levels of complexity. And so there's a lot of confusing language out there. Strategic thinking, learning agility, there's all these things that is just too vague and generic. You know, are you talking about strategic thinking in terms of a 12-month plan? Or are you talking about a strategic plan for a 20-year plan? That requires a very different level of capability in terms of managing complexity. IPC is really about someone's capability to handle the complexity of the work. Every one of us wants to be in a job that is right at the right level for our capability around complexity. And by the way, we all grow in our capability to handle complexity over our careers, but we grow at different rates. So some people, like John Bryant, grow very quickly and keep taking on more and more complexity and blow people away because they can handle it. Other people start to plateau out, and Dr. Jacks believed, and we could have a debate on this if you like, but that we all grow over our careers at different rates. But it's like our physical height. Once we reach our physical height, once we reach our height on IPC, we're likely not going to be able to go up to the next level. And let me explain what I mean by that. Here's a great example. So when I was in high school in Battle Creek, Michigan, I worked for 3 years at Jim's Country Fried Chicken. And my job was not very complex. I had to take the orders, pack the chicken, clean the restaurant, pack the salads, and make sure the chefs weren't moving off. And it was really a basic job. Any problem that came up in the store got escalated to the manager. My time horizon for decision making was about a day. Planning how many salads needed to be made the night before or the next day, whether it was a day during the week or if it was the weekend. Very non-complex. No judgment or discretion. Time horizon very near term. as you think about your own careers and the jobs that you've done through your own career, you can think about the jumps up that you've taken in scope and scale and complexity, right? So, I started as a compensation analyst. I had a group in the business. I had to do compensation surveys and analysis for jobs. Then I moved to compensation manager and then the director of a shared services group. And so you think about your own career, the scope and scale has grown over time, right? Make sense? We all know that sometimes people get promoted a level beyond their capability. That's called the Peter Principle. We also know, every one of us knows if we're in a job, that the job is overfacing us. It's too much complexity. Everybody knows, and nobody wants to be in that situation because it's very stressful. We also all know when we're in a job that we are bored by. In other words, our capability is much greater than the complexity of the work. I'm sure many of you have been at that place in your career as well as I have. The goal of every manager is to try to get people in the roles that best match their capability to handle the complexity. And with coaching and learning and on-the-job experiences where many of us are able to take on more. But if you think about capability around complexity, I know Keith Nosbush had this capability to think out 20 years. He had the ability to know in 20 years this is where Rockwell Automation needs to be, and conceptually he could plan out what are all the strategic relationships we need to build today in order to position us for 20 years down the road. He was able to say we need a strategic partnership with Cisco and Microsoft, and we need to build our partner network so that we have a good contingency of organizations that can support what our customers need if we don't do it. He had that ability. He would sit in meetings and he would say things that always blew me away. Like, I do not have this IPC, he did. He would say, well, we can't do that. Do they realize if we do that, what the implications are going to be in 10 years? That's a higher mental model of the world. Does that make sense? This is the thing, because sometimes IPC seems a little bit complicated. This is not about IQ. Okay, this is about capability around managing a lot of complexity, being able to anticipate either 12 months, 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7 years, 7 to 10 years, 20 years beyond. And guess what? I could interview any one of you who are a people manager today, and in 5 minutes you could tell me of your direct reports, which of those people are a good match for the complexity of the role, which of them are in jobs where they're bored and they need to take on more, and which of them are in the jobs where they're struggling with the complexity. Managers intuitively know this. It's a very easy exercise. And so the thing to think about for yourself is, how well do I manage the complexity of my role? Am I trying to think at how my manager's thinking and thinking on a broader scope and scale? How am I thinking about how far out in the future am I planning for? And how do my managers think about how capable I am at handling complexity? This is a really key one, because if we put people in jobs and they can't handle complexity, this is what sinks companies. This is where decisions get made a level below where they should get made, and that's where companies lose billions of dollars in shareholder value. You can read the book. There's a great book called $1 Billion Lessons, and it talks about companies that lost a lot of shareholder value. If you read it through the lens of the CEO and the leaders at the top, were they operating, were they paying attention to all the things happening in the environment that were converging to make them irrelevant? And you start to see how some of those leaders missed some of those elements in the horizon because they weren't connecting all the dots, all right? So that's IPC. John Bryan had very high IPC. I can think of a lot of people that had very high capacity for complexity. So that's the second category, and we'll come back. All right, the third one is my very favorite. I could talk all day on stories about this one. T stands for temperament. And so this is what I want you to think about with temperament. Temperament means our nature. Our temperament is how we show up in the world. Our temperament means that we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. We all have positive things that make us unique and special, and they're the gifts that we bring to the world, and we all have blind spots and derailers. The issue isn't to try to find the perfect person, because no such thing exists. By the way, one of my temperament things I have to manage carefully is perfectionism, because that can be a negative. But one of the things we have to pay attention to is every role requires a different temperament. And so some temperaments will work great in one role, but be miserable in another role. And somebody talked about on the panel, I think it was the same person talking about skills and experiences aren't everything. It's also your, I think you talked about the attitude. So who was the person that said that, if you're too cocky or arrogant? Who said that? That was really good. Who said that? What's that?
Her name was Alia Berman.
Did she leave because she knew I was speaking? She made a great point though, because temperament only becomes a problem if it impairs the person's effectiveness in the role or the effectiveness of the people they're working with, right? So we all have our quirks, we all have our oddest, idiosyncrasies, but if it impairs our effectiveness, then it's a problem. And so this is where you really have to think about which kind of roles would I be best suited for. So I'll give you some great examples. I had a guy that I worked with back at Kellogg's. This guy was A+ on ski. His capacity for looking out into the future and anticipating what consumers wanted in food and packaging and innovation was phenomenal. He could look around the corners. He seemed to know. He had this like crystal ball. These people had this capability to know this is where we need to be and this is what we need to do to get there. Oftentimes, people that are high in ski and high in IPC can sometimes have the tendency to think everybody should be as fast and as quick as they are. And when you're not, they get a little judgmental and sometimes impatient, and that can come off as arrogance. A lot of these people don't even realize they're being arrogant, but their judgment of other people, that they're not keeping up with them, comes out feeling judgmental and arrogant. When we feel someone's judgment, even if they're not saying it, it always feels like they're condescending, right? So that's one of the issues. So this guy, this leader I worked with, was brilliant in the first two categories. And he also was creating an impairment in his effectiveness because of his temperament, which I'll tell you about in a minute. His colleagues, the peers on this leadership team running this big business, did not include him in meetings because they knew he was volatile, angry, aggressive, and unpredictable. So they just didn't include him in meetings. He started losing top talent. Top talent didn't want to work for him because he was too much of a bully. And he also aspired to be the head of his function for the whole company. And I remember one time trying to talk him off the ledge because he was ready to quit because the company wasn't recognizing his brilliance. Now granted, he was brilliant and he was creating a lot of value for the company and his capabilities. However, his temperament was distracting everybody from how good he was. And so 2 weeks before he had an offsite with his whole leadership team and all of his partners, external partners, two of his leaders, two of the directors came to my office and said, "Susan, we want you to come to his offsite." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because if you're there, he will behave." And I knew this, right? So anytime HR is in the room, everybody thinks they can't have fun, which is not true. I want to clarify that. But in this case, people tend to be on their best behavior, which I think is really funny because I'm often not on my best behavior. But anyway, here's what happened. I went to his meeting. I sat there for 3 days. I watched him, and he was absolutely brilliant. He was really, truly a gifted individual. And on a break, I got the courage, because these things are never easy to do. And I went up to him and I said, "I figured out why you're not getting promoted." And he looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" It's this British guy. He looked at me like, "What?" I said, "I figured out why you're not getting promoted." So he was feeling all that frustration and confusion, right, that many of us feel. This is a very high-level executive ready to quit because he's not being recognized and being promoted to the top job. I said, "I know why you're not getting promoted. You're distracting everybody from how talented you are with your temperament." And I didn't say it quite like that, but he looked at me. I wasn't sure what he was going to do because he was really a bully. I mean, he was a little scary. I don't really like scary people either, right? One of my temperament things is angry people scare me. So, but anyway, I'm doing this because it's my job. So I say this to him, and he melted. He actually hugged me. Nobody ever hugs HR. It was so nice. He thanked me, and then he did something that I still to this day cannot believe. I give him so much credit for this. He said, "Susan, I need you to do me a favor." He was totally unaware that this temperament was showing up. And people that are really gifted minimize some of this negative temperament. I'm giving an extreme example. But what was so funny was he says to me, "Will you do me a favor? Will you sit next to me in every meeting from here on out?" Because we're in a lot of meetings together. "And every time I start to do this, will you kick me under the table?" I would love to. And so like the next week we're back at the office and we're in this leadership team meeting, and this was 9 really tough guys from all over the world. They were big energies, right? And I remember he and the head of sales and the head of innovation started to get into this fight. And I'm watching it thinking, "Oh no, here it goes." And I turned and I kicked him as hard as I could. And he looked at me. I thought he was going to choke me because he was so surprised I did it. And I just smiled sweetly. And he realized what he was doing. And I got to give the guy a lot of credit. He started to really work on it and become more aware of his tendency when he was stressed that, what could be described as a bully came out. Now that's an extreme example of temperament from a negative standpoint. I want to give you an example from a positive standpoint because it really depends on the role, right? So I have worked with a lot of people, leaders, who aspire to be a CEO. That's not uncommon in organizations. And I will tell you, one of the biggest reasons why many people don't get to the top, it's not because of their ski. They have all the skills, knowledge, experience, and education to do the job. It's not because they probably couldn't handle the complexity of thinking up at the next level and planning out further out, managing a lot more stakeholders and complexities around shareholders and investors and potential activists and management and unions and whatever else they have to manage. The point is that they had an element of their temperament that they were too nice. They didn't like making tough decisions. I worked with such a great guy. His dream job was to go and be the voice and welcomer at Disney's haunted house. I mean, he was the nicest guy you could ever imagine. He could look at a P&L and in 20 seconds tell you what was wrong with your business. The guy was brilliant, but he was so nice he wanted everybody to like him. And he left people on his team that were weak. He had a hard time dealing with that, and so he couldn't make some of the tough decisions. And when you get to CEO, you're making a lot of unpopular decisions. And he did not get the nod. And in fact, it was John Bryant who got the nod, and this man who I adore to this day left the organization and now works in private equity. And there are lots of examples of that where people are just too nice. Another example of an individual who came into my office one day really mad because she didn't get a job. She felt she should have been promoted to vice president. Actually, another woman got the job, and she was going to prove to me why she got the job. This was not a direct report to me, it was one of the business leaders. She comes in, she lays out all the evidence why she should have been promoted. Her resume, her 360 stuff on competencies. By the way, we've gotten rid of the competencies. We know I use suitability model to help us. She laid out all the strengths finders, everything, and basically said, look at all these reasons I should have been promoted. And she was so mad she was going to quit, right? This is what happens. And so I'm listening to her, and I said, okay. I drew out a little chart with the 4 things: skiing, IBC, temperament, and then I haven't explained the last one, so I'll get there in a minute. I said, you know what? I can understand why you felt you should have had it from the ski standpoint. I agree that you were perfectly aligned to do this role based on your skills, knowledge, experience, and education. Complexity. I cannot judge that because I have never worked with you on a project. But here are 3 questions to go back and ask your manager or your manager once removed, what they think about your capability to manage complexity. What's their view? Do they think you're fully managing it today? Do they think there are areas that you could be doing more? Are there places, how do they feel if you were to go to the next level? What do they think about your capability? And I said, you'd have to go back and ask these questions. And I got to temperament, I said, you should thank the company for not promoting you to vice president. And she looked at me shocked, what do you mean? And I said, everything you just told me is that you are an amazing collaborator. You're a facilitator, you're a consensus driver. You bring people together to problem solve. Those are wonderful elements of your temperament. And in this particular job, you would have been miserable. Because the job that she didn't get was a job that required the individual to go out and get into everybody's business to drive massive amounts, hundreds of millions of dollars in productivity, which makes people mad. She would have hated it. And I saw the light bulb, literally I saw a light bulb go on over her head. Because she's not a qualified, capable, valuable member of the company. But for this particular role, she wasn't most suited. And so the hiring manager, every single time a hiring manager is making a choice about who to put into different roles, he or she intuitively, most of them, not all, but most, I'll do another presentation on bad managers, that's another favorite topic, we'll do that later. But most good managers have good intentions, they're trying to get the right people in the right roles. And so they're making a trade-off. Can I live without all the ski? Because I think they're going to be brilliant in handling complexity. And overall, I think we can manage the temperament. By the way, our temperament, as I mentioned before, some of us overestimate ourselves, underestimate ourselves. This is a key place to get feedback from people that know you well. What do you see are my temperament strengths and weaknesses? Temperament's just not about temperament, it's about our nature. Some people are too passive. Management doesn't think they're going to step in and make some of the tough decisions or take on tough personalities. Understand your temperament, and then you're much more capable to play your strengths and downplay the weaknesses. I have a lot of weaknesses. We could spend 3 hours on my weaknesses. 20 years ago, I was not assertive. I kept quiet. I didn't want people to judge me because I didn't want to be perceived as not being smart because I had concerns about people not liking me. And I've done a lot of work on it. My boss laughs, it's like, you don't need to work on assertive anymore. But I've been working on it because my natural temperament is not to always speak up when I need to, but I know my role requires it. So I've learned different techniques to help me do things that are not comfortable for my temperament. I'm very clear about being someone who wants people to like me, being somebody who has a tendency to be hard on herself and how perfectionism plays out in my life. That's hard on me. I can be hard on my teams. I have to manage that. My team has permission to call me on it when they see me doing that. And so it's being aware of it, because it's not about trying to ignore it or not paying attention to it, but leveraging it to your benefit and then downplaying it where you can. And then I don't know how much more time I have, but there's one last story. Another great example of temperament. We had an opening for a job, a key role in the company, and this is at Rockwell. The company, one of the businesses, was not profitable for many years. The former CEO felt very strongly the person we put in that role needed the ski to do the job. It's a very technical area. As an engineering technology company, myself and one of my colleagues sat down with the CEO and said, "We think you should take a bet on somebody else." Person that we put in the job after much convincing was not someone who had the ski for the role. They had good ski, they had good relevant experience, but it wasn't the specific technical experience that was required. But the person had the capacity to understand why the business wasn't working, had the capability to make the tough calls and do a 3 to 5 year plan. And he had a personality like General Patton. He was gonna go in there and turn that business around and take people out if he needed to and cut costs and redesign it. And he's been in that role for almost 5 years. He's done a beautiful job. He's been profitable for the last 4. So that's another great example. And so managers are trying to decide when they're looking at candidates, no candidates are ever equal on these 3 elements, right? And so you're always making trade-offs. The last element, this is temperament fun. I love temperament. There's temperament. Here we go. The last element is really every job has a set of obligations and demands, a set of requirements. And it's really important that we talk to people about what those obligations and demands are to make sure that there's no reason that they wouldn't want to take on the job. It could be a relocation's required. It could be 24/7 availability. It could be that you have to manage people, which has a whole set of requirements. Not everybody wants to do that. So it's important to look at, it's not just about getting a different title or more money or more status, but do you actually value doing the kind of work that's required? Are there parts of it that aren't something that you enjoy doing? And so when you look at it from your standpoint, when you're looking at different jobs and different opportunities in the organization, both in terms of development, really doing an honest assessment. We don't have time today to do the workshop. I have a whole workshop around helping people look at themselves in these 4 different categories. But really being clear that when decisions are getting made around you of different people going into different roles, I can guarantee you, good managers may not use this language, but they're picking people that they think are going to be the most suited based on a judgment across these categories. And that's why one of the reasons why this model was so welcomed when we rolled it out to all of our people managers globally. People managers went, "Oh, finally, this is really helpful." We can have really good development discussions with people. We can have really good discussions with candidates who don't get jobs and why they didn't get it. One last story on this, and then I'll make some time for some Q&A. We had an opening in our organization for a really critical job in one of our regions. And we were very fortunate. We had 12 internal candidates for this job. So the senior vice president came to me and says, "Oh my God, Susan, I got 12 candidates. What do I do?" I said, "Easy. Have each candidate fill out an assessment on the suitability model." We call these 4 things the suitability model, looking at who's most suited to do a role. Have them do a self-assessment. We have a great template to do that. And then have their manager read it and add his or her own comments into that assessment. And that will be a way to help screen the numbers of people, because there were some easy requirements for the roles we could screen folks out. When it got right down to it, I think they interviewed 4 top candidates, and we ended up with 2 finalists. In the end, the hiring manager made a choice about which candidate he thought was most suited to the role. He put more emphasis in ski for some very good reasons, because it's all contextual, right? Every situation has context, and every manager is trying to make the best decisions in that context with the right person in the roles. And that's exactly what he did. One of the candidates had a ton of ski, solid IPC, a fairly quiet temperament, and both candidates valued the role. The other candidate had less of the ski, tons of capacity for complexity. This person will very likely be a senior executive president, senior vice president at some point in her career. And then also the temperaments were different. But the hiring manager has to sit back and say, what do I think is going to be the best match at this time for this company in this particular case? And he made the choice to go with a candidate that was heavier on ski than in another. I've got an opening right now for a Vice President Total Rewards. If any of you have that capability, please call me. I'll give you my phone number. I've had a job open for a while because I have high expectations for capacity for complexity and temperament. And I've got ski requirements. I mean, I really like somebody who's got board of directors, compensation committee experience, executive comp. But I'm willing to trade off some of that if I can get what I think would be the capability to manage the role and learn it. So that's the model. We've named it the suitability model because it's really all about assessing suitability for roles and matches. Hopefully this has given some insight to you about your own career, some of the things that have happened around your own career with other people, why people, why do some really talented people get fired? I can tell you a lot, it's almost always because of either IBC wasn't right and or they had some element of their temperament that was impairing their effectiveness so much they got fired. I'll go back to my boss that I had at Kellogg, the one that only lasted 14 months, who was throwing myself and our president under the bus because we overspent our budget because we were arrogant. His temperament, he was like a scared rabbit. You think about a leader who was so passive and so afraid and insecure, all the elements of his temperament led him to be ineffective in standing up to a CEO who was a really big personality, very strong, very angry and aggressive. And all he needed to do was get the facts, which is exactly what we did, and we calm the situation right now. And so that's, in my humble opinion, 30 years of experience, this model has explained more to me about what goes on in organizations for people than anything I've ever seen. And also, I started thinking about this. This is just an added bonus for you showing up today. So again, this is your extra gift. No more money, but it's a good gift. You can actually take this model, I think, and analyze every one of your personal relationships with a significant other. The ones that didn't work out, I can guarantee you there was a gap on IBC or a temperament issue that caused you to end that relationship. Right? And I'm going to think about that all night long, but it's true. If you're working with somebody, actually, I wish I had more time, because if you're a certain level of capability, and there's a lot of science behind it, managing complexity, and you're in a relationship, either a work relationship or a manager relationship or a personal relationship, and the person's a couple gaps lower, I'm telling you the relationship's not gonna work out. You're gonna get really bored. And then if there's extreme in temperament, we all know past relationships sometimes aren't good. So that's your extra gift. You can apply it to all your personal relationships. This is the actual model. I know that's too many words, so that's why I don't use it. But this is the brilliance of Dr. Elliott Jack's original research. A lot of his contemporaries have added to it. When you get people in the right role, you end up getting high performance for the company in terms of that particular job, and you end up with an employee who feels fully enabled and capable to do the role, and you have great results. And so that, to me, is the secrets to success, is understanding that and then applying it. So now, I'll just, I think I have about 4 or 5 minutes to take a couple questions, and happy to do that. Do we have mics or no? Okay.
Have you used the suitability model at all when doing performance reviews?
We do. It actually has become a really helpful tool for coaching, helpful tool for development discussions, helpful tool in performance. We use it in our succession planning process as well, where we're talking about who do we think are most suited to do jobs that move up in the organization. We use it when we're talking about, when we're going through succession planning and Jocelyn, right? When, if we're talking about Jocelyn and where we think she should go, we may say, you know what, we need to test her capacity for more complexity. Let's give her a bigger assignment. It could be on the job. Let's give her an assignment where she's got global responsibility to see how she can pull together global people that she has to influence. We have intentional discussions around testing and pushing on capacity for complexity and giving people an opportunity to show that they can handle more. When we're talking about temperament, we'll talk about, well, what's the part of their temperament that's actually a potential derailer? Are they aware of it? Have we been direct with them? Have we given them a feedback in the performance review? What I found, and this is another crazy thing I've done, I read every single development plan for all of our high potential and early potential career people in the company. And I've done it many years. And what I found early on is that the individual fills out his or her own development plan and never necessarily identify the real issue that's going to hold them back. That is my biggest pet peeve, when people don't really know what the real issue is. And so I've been pushing my HR vice presidents, pushing their teams, pushing the leaders. I used to send notes out to employees all over the world. And if they did a great job in their development plan highlighting the real issue, because I know what their real issues are. You know, they'll talk about different people, say, you know, she's just not pushing hard enough. Or he's just, you know, he's too aggressive, he's too much of a bully. Okay, I don't see that in a development plan. Are they getting the feedback either through development or in their performance review? Because if they're not, they're gonna be confused when they don't get promoted. And I feel like it's the company's job to give the direct feedback and then to work with the person in a way that hopefully supports what they most want. Now, sometimes people disagree with manager's judgment. That's why you need manager once removed involved as well. There's some controls and checks that need to be in place. And if the manager and manager once removed think the person's not gonna go to a certain level, we should have a conversation with people and give them the option to self-select and do something else. That's the fair thing to do, and that's when you start to create trust in the organization. So we've done a lot. We're working on selection guides right now using the model. You're welcome. One more question? I have 1 minute and 3 seconds.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Susan. So my name is Taraji Rucker. I'm an HR professional, and as you talk about this, I'm very passionate about it, so I kind of get goosebumps. So my question is a little bit bold in terms of HR. So I think the
bold HR.
model that you talked about is great. That's something you go out and we do with the business. But what are your thoughts and your perspective about how HR does that internally? Because oftentimes HR can be the stepchild and may not bring some of those, you know, those good juices back home. And so I would just love to hear your perspective on that from a
Thank you. No, it's a great question. First of all, I had a major learning with the global HR team. So I've got about 450 people on my team. And when the suitability model is so obvious to me how helpful it is that we just started moving it forward in the organization. And I did not do the necessary change management with HR. Because HR, I love HR is my middle name, so of course I love HR people. HR people are very attached to what we know. And so the team was very attached. We had 15 competencies in our overly engineered competency model. Anytime I did performance review on the competency model, I cried. The head of HR was crying with tissue in her office doing performance reviews because we had too much information trying to assess people. So we had to do some intentional work to slow things down from a change standpoint before we went out to people managers to bring HR into the process. And so it's really important. We did global workshops, change management workshops with HR to get their input about what they most needed to have in order to support this new way of thinking about talent as we rolled it out. So we use the methodology in the model in HR all the time. Our processes within HR are no different than for the rest of the organization. So when our leadership team's doing succession planning, looking at who are the future vice presidents in the organization, who could be CHRO, we're talking about them through the lens of the suitability model. It's become the language in the company. And it's really, we introduced the model to our 3,000 plus people managers in 2014. I have people managers all over the world that are, it's become innate. So we use the methodology within HR, but we also had to go through a whole process of helping HR understand what we were doing and that they weren't going to need to pull an off-the-shelf competency model anymore, which was scary, literally, rightly so. But what we were giving them was actually going to be more effective and make more of a difference for managers. One last question.
From your experience, how much is the impact of the CEO personality on that suitability model? Let me explain a little bit. If you have a CEO that is much more aggressive and kind of in your face, is driving that culture throughout the organization, do you see companies adapting to that and preferring that type of management over kind of a more diverse, more adaptable to the type of situation?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive question. Actually, there's a whole body of research. Sen Delaney, which is a really cool company, works with a lot of companies. They came up with the concept of shadow of the leader. And what they basically say is whatever your leader's makeup is, temperament, capacity for complexity, how they think about the world, they cast that shadow through the whole organization. And so people start to emulate the CEO in terms of behaviors. It doesn't necessarily mean that that the organization is looking just for people that have that kind of temperament. We all have our own we're all so different, it's hard to even compare us in a model. But it's very common where the CEO sets the shadow for the kind of behaviors that get reinforced. That doesn't necessarily mean it's consistent with the person overall in terms of temperament or capacity for complexity. But you do see people adapting to behaviors they see the CEO do or don't do. And so it's really important in the organizations, one of the important roles of HR is to make sure that we're creating organizations that are healthy. If you have a lot of people that are acting a certain way and no one's standing up or doing anything differently, that's really a dysfunctional organization. And making sure you've got people in roles that can help leaders understand where their overall, essence, if you will, the makeup of all these things, is impairing or helping the organization. So every CEO is like every one of us. They have their pluses and their minuses, but they do cast that shadow. And then you start to see people mimicking it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's
Especially the
consistent.
T.
What's that?
The T, it's the one that drives a lot of that
Oh,
culture.
the T, yeah, the
How they
temperament, for
behave
sure. Oh, yeah.
on the meetings, and that
Yep. I
trickles down
completely
on the
agree.
organization.
Yep. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm way over my time. Oh, the red thing is-
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for your passion, for all the information that you share with us, and especially because I'm pretty sure that now there's a lot of people excited about joining Rockwell.
Yeah, we're recruiting, so thanks very much, Mom. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. Nah, I'm fair. Thank you. Bye, everybody.